If you've got a guy who's sitting at home with his kids all day, just having a fun time, and occasionally goes out and mows the lawn and spending lots of late brunches with his wife and saying hi to the neighbours, but never does a day's actual remunerative work, he hasn't got a problem with work-life balance. Okay, his work is terrible, and the rest of his life is terrible too. The problem is not about balance. The problem is just about doing it wisely and doing it well.
Put your hands together. This is going to be amazing, everybody. Pastor Steve Jeffery, come on.
If I had known that my introduction to this illustrious stage would have been to the tune Sweet Caroline, I'd have worn my clerical robes. Thank you very much for that introduction. So, one of my kids, we were talking at breakfast time on Sunday last week, one of my kids said, so, Dad, what are you going to be talking about at Workspace? Are you just there kind of to introduce all those famous people? Which, of course, is an outrageous and slanderous suggestion. I am not here merely to introduce those famous people. I'm going to be introducing all those highly competent, productive, experienced, successful, famous people. That's why I'm here. And in truth, I mean, you've met some of these guys. Kyle has assembled quite a lineup, businessmen and investors and entrepreneurs and thought leaders. And my goal really is quite simple. What I'd like to do, the Lord being my helper, is to set before you some kind of foundation for all this. I want to set before you something like a biblical theology of work. What does the Bible teach about this subject that we are here to think about? And more specifically, what does Scripture teach more granularly about the particular issues that our other speakers are going to be focusing on? So some simple, familiar ground. I suspect most of what I say for the first couple of minutes after this brief introduction will be familiar to many of you. But then I want to step on the gas a little bit and talk about the relationship between work and human dignity and purpose and the importance of hard work, the importance of finding the right people for the job, figure out how to coordinate our work with other people, to talk about the relationship between work and other aspects of life. We've got C.R. Wiley's going to be helping us to think about how work in the workplace, quote unquote, interacts with family life and marriage and raising children and so on. And then a biblical understanding of risk. I've never heard anybody try to articulate anything like a biblical theology of risk, so maybe we'll try and squeeze one of those in to set the stage for David Rees to talk about some of the investment issues that he's familiar with. And if I can lay the foundation for all these famous people, I will have done my job. I'll happily go back to being non-famous again. So, 7 points I'd like to make. Members of All Saints will now realise that this talk shall only take 2 or 3 hours. That's fine. Just relax, make yourselves comfortable. Okay, so let's just begin. The Bible begins, you will have noticed, with an account of the work that God does. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The first sentence of the Bible is a statement about God's work. In fact, if you read the Hebrew text, it's even more pointed than this. In Hebrew, the verb comes before its subject in most clauses. So the first thing the Bible says is, in the beginning, first word, second word, He created. If you were reading the Bible for the first time, you would have got the idea that the living God is not some kind of philosophical abstraction. He's not there just to be our friend, though by God's grace He is. The first thing that the Bible tells us about God is that He works, and it tells us what He does. He creates the heavens and the earth. That's a merismatic expression, meaning that it's an indication of the totality of a thing by pointing to the extremes of it. The heavens the highest point above us, the earth where we stand, the lowest point, and the implication, of course, is everything in between. All things, absolutely everything, the whole of created reality owes its existence to the living God. God works not just in making things and then walking away. We don't believe in a deistic kind of creator, the kind of cosmic clockmaker who gets things started, sets them up, then walks away. Scripture teaches that God is involved in creation and providence. All things, in him they live and move and have their being. They continue to exist only because God continues to work at sustaining them. Nothing in creation is backwardsly eternal. Nothing in creation is self-existent. All things owe their existence and their ongoing being to the fact that God is, Hebrews 1, upholding the universe by the word of his power. And therefore, what that means is because everything is from him, everything is for him, everything is to glorify him. Notice the logic of Romans 11:36, the climax, really, of the first 11 chapters of that magnificent letter. From him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Notice the implied logic. Because it is the case that everything is from him, because it is the case that everything comes through the word of his power, because it is the case that everything is to be given to him, it means he is to be glorified forever in all things. And so what that means is that Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 1, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Everything we are, everything we do, somehow has to be connected to that purpose. If it's not, we are losing touch with reality. We're losing touch with created reality, and therefore we're losing touch with the one who made it. Now, I know it's not obvious how brushing your teeth in the morning might be connected to glorifying God. It might not be obvious at times how aspects of your paid employment or your labor as a father or a mother or your studies at school are connected to glorifying God. But if we can't figure out, at least in principle, how everything is there to glorify God, we've got to stop doing whatever it is that we're doing. The name for things that don't glorify God is sin or immaturity, childlikeness, and we're called to grow up in Christ, the one who's grown up. So, first, the Bible begins with that account of God's work and calls us then, secondly, to imitate it. Human beings were created to imitate and share in God's work. Again, this will be very familiar to you. We can cover this pretty quickly, I hope. Towards the end of the first chapter of the Bible, we've got the account of the 6 days of creation. On the 6th day, at the climax of God's creative work, we read this, chapter 1, verse 26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." My goodness, what would it mean? What would it mean to be made in the image of God? You may know that in the ancient world, the term for the image was often applied to a statue that was placed in the central square of the towns over which the king, whose statue it was, ruled. When Alexander the Great kind of just moved from Macedonia and went east, conquering everything as he went, he just named every town or every other town. He came across Alexandria. That's why there's so many Alexandrias in the ancient world. And as he named them Alexandria, he placed his statue in the town square, his image in the town square. Alexander rules here. Who is it who is the image of God? God made man. Let us make man in our image, male and female, we'll see in a moment. But notice, what would it mean? Verse 26 again, "Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Let them do the thing that we, Father, Son, and Spirit, do." I used to not be persuaded that the plural here was a reference to the triune persons. I kind of almost nearly am now. I'm close enough. But either way, it's true, isn't it? It's true that the tri-personal relational God rules all things. And here, he bestows that extraordinary dignity on you and me. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. We're going to come to that in a few minutes because this is not a task that Adam can just sort of do on his own, knock off in an afternoon. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. You see, the clear implication is this, right? That the way in which we are to glorify God is by doing what he does. Imitating him by working. That's what taking dominion over the world involves. It means going out into the forest and taking those good and glorious trees and chopping them down and stripping off the branches and making them into planks and constructing a cabin for you and your wife to live in, Adam. Taking something that's good and beautiful and mixing it with your labor to make something that's better and more beautiful. Those of you who know about the Austrian economic tradition will recognize the echoes of the theory of the acquisition of property. You acquire new property, like new land, by mixing your labor with it. That's how you acquire possession of something. It's how you beautify something. It's what Adam and Eve are called to do here. What that means, of course, is that Genesis 1 has already driven a truck straight through all our sacred secular dichotomies. Right? We have this, we're still all recovering pietists, aren't we, right? And so you've got kind of working life over here and all the stuff I've got to do, mow the grass, and I've got to get up in the morning and answer 500 emails before breakfast and all this. And then I've got my faith and my spiritual life over here. Well, if the way that we glorify God by working, then we've just brought those two poles of our existence together, haven't we? This was rediscovered during the Protestant Reformation. William Tyndale. William Tyndale, you would think he's burned at the stake for believing in justification by faith alone and believing that, it's a good idea to have the Bible in your own language. He was burned at the stake for this conviction also. There is no work better to please God. To pour water, to wash dishes, to be a cobbler, or an apostle are all one as touching the deed to please God. Imagine how the medieval Catholic Church reacted with horror to the thought that you don't naturally need to be kind of revved up and become a monk or a nun in order to please Jesus. That your daily labors, being a cobbler, putting shoes on horses or bread on the table, is a delight in the sight of God. It raises some important questions, of course, because we face the perennial temptation to make our Christian worldview visible in our work in other ways. Now, look, let's be honest, this is an understandable impulse, isn't it? It's a good thing for our faith to be visible in how we live, and it's a good thing for our faith to be visible in what we say. But we're living in a world where the workplace is increasingly a context for progressive activism. And the danger is that we react against that by making the workplace a context for just a different kind of activism. Our kind of activism. So you imagine for a second, just take a purely random example. You own a painting and decorating firm. This would be amusing, right? Let's imagine this. And so you've got, you sent your 3 guys out and they've got this big commercial job to do. They've got to paint all the walls inside here, redo the woodwork. And you call the guy at the end of the second day and it's like, how's it going? He's going, it's fantastic. The job's going really, really well. And the boss is like, have you done the walls? You wanted the woodwork yet? It's like, well, no, not exactly. But we had this great conversation about Calvinism with the guy who cleans the next office. And, he was so excited. So we got those James White debate videos, he's got them on his phone and we listened to them together. It's only like 5 hours. And we're pretty sure he's going to become a Calvinist soon. Tomorrow we're going to go to that debate with Greg Strawbridge and that other guy about paedo baptism. We'll probably get to the painting by lunchtime. There's a little bit of that, perhaps, isn't there? The desire to get our convictions into the workplace at the cost of doing the job. Let me tell you, the first and most significant task of a Christian worker is not to tell other people about Jesus. Now, you just heard that from a pastor. The first and most significant task of a Christian worker is to be the best Christian worker you can be. Now, of course, the way that we are going to be the best Christian worker we can be will be, from time to time, informed by Christian values. In fact, in one sense, it's always suffused with Christian values, sometimes more explicitly than others. But what we mustn't do is imagine we're only really doing the Lord's work if we're telling people about Jesus. Of course, it's a wonderful... I rejoice. There are men and women in the church that I pastor here in Fort Worth who are here because their neighbours and friends talk to them about Jesus. That is not your job if you're a painter and decorator. Stop it. Or talk about Jesus on your lunch hour. Because we glorify God by imitating his work. Now, like I said, there are situations where the intrusion of ideological frameworks, Christian ideological frameworks, or the pushback against progressive ones becomes more explicit. Example from our friend David Barnson. Let me just share this with you and I'll sketch it and get him to comment on it if you want a little bit more. I learned from David's communications that the Barnson Group has been partnering with Boyer Research to push back against some of the progressive shareholder activism that is making its way into boardrooms. Okay? Now, basically what happens is a progressive group buys enough shares in, Exxon or JP Morgan or something to get put themselves in a position to put a motion to the board meeting, or the annual shareholder meeting, with the goal of pushing a progressive agenda, whether it's a climate agenda at Exxon or it's a please debank the Conservatives for JP Morgan. Right? See what happens? Now, I was fascinated to read David's response. Let me quote from what David said. You get him to comment a bit more on it later. Here's what he said. I do not want to use my influence as an investor to pull companies into various political or social causes. My intention in this proposal is the opposite. It is for shareholder interest by getting politics out of the company, not by putting more politics into the company. Can you see the temptation? We feel so incensed by the progressive craziness that many of you encounter in the workplace that you want to respond ideologically. Old pastor friend of mine, he used to just say in so many different situations, show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. It actually raises a philosophical question because it sounds partly like we're proposing a kind of neutral ground. You know, you've got the ideological progressivism over here, and we just want to do work in the middle and avoid this Christian activism here. Mistake. It's a mistake. Just working is already Christian activism. Just being the best employee you can be is Christian activism. Cornelius Van Til isn't now spinning in his grave, right? I promise. All, and I count myself among them, all the Van Tilians, all the presuppositionalists in here can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not suggesting that work occupies a neutral zone and we do work instead of making Christian ideological statements in the world. Working is a Christian ideological statement in the world. Please can we clear out the business of progressive activism so that we can fill our workplace with workers. Isn't that what Red Balloon's about? Where's Andrew Krapachetz? Is he coming tomorrow? Can you see what we're trying to do? Now, that raises a bunch of other questions about, like, well, when's that going to have the effect of creating the explicitly Christian landscape that we all long for? I'll make some comments on that in a few minutes' time. One day, the implicit dependence of everybody who ever does any work on Christian normative ideological values will be made explicit. That's what I think. My eschatology is post-mill. What we can't do is shortcut the process And isn't it the temptation to want to shortcut the process? Isn't it the temptation to want to fix the world now? Don't we respond with a degree of frustration when we are told that something takes a long time? We'll come to that in a few minutes' time. So that's the second thing. We're called to imitate God with the astonishing privilege of sharing in his work. Third, work is hard because the world is big and people are fallen. Genesis 1, it's already implicit, isn't it? Genesis 1:26. Not just fill this little corner of the garden and take a few trees down. Fill the world, subdue it, rule over all creation, the heavens and the earth. Take dominion over all things, the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the fish, everything else is to be brought under the rule of the Lord Jesus Christ by people working to turn that which is good and glorious into something which is better and more glorious. But the difficulty becomes immeasurably more intense. A couple of chapters later, you're familiar with the narrative of the fall. I think it's a shame that it's called the fall, by the way. The rebellion would be a better description of what happens in Genesis 3, wouldn't it? Where Adam and Eve proudly grasp and foolishly grasp at that which has at this point been denied to them and incur God's judgment against them. Now, what form does the judgment take? You've all noticed this, right? Genesis 3. To the woman, God said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband. He shall rule over you. Pain in the distinctive vocation that women are blessed as mothers if they're able to bear children. That women are blessed to undertake. I've witnessed the birth of all three of my kids. Jeepers, that was painful. But it doesn't stop there. Verse 17, to Adam he said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife, you've eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shan't eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat your bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Now the pain really starts. And many of you know this experience. You know the experience of work that is frustrating. You know the experience of work that is thankless. You know the experience of work that feels futile, whether it's manual labor or banging your head against a computer screen, one way or the other. All of our work lies under the shadow, not just of Genesis 1, which is hard enough, but Genesis 3. Now, this creates a challenge that is it's one of those themes that's missed, but as the Bible unfolds, this turns out to be a huge deal. The difficulty of human work and the moral imperative to take it on anyway. We are not to be a bunch of semi-sanctified whiners complaining at our lot. Time and time again, we find in Scripture an honest, upfront profession of the actual difficulty of work. And example after example after example of people who just grab it by the scruff of the neck, take it on, and drive a truck through it. Examples. Think of Ruth. It's a wonderful little book, one of my favorite books of the Bible. And there's that fantastic little cameo in the second chapter of Ruth. You know how the narrative proceeds. So Ruth and Naomi have come back from Moab. They've left, the men have died, Mahlon and Chilion and Elimelech, Naomi's husband. Naomi's kind of complaining about everything, and it's like, oh, woe is me, and the Lord sent me away full, he's brought me back empty. And then chapter 2 starts, and Ruth says, remember what she says? Let me go. Let me go and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. You know what gleaning involved? Of course you know what gleaning involved. What gleaning involved was crawling around in the dust, picking up individual grains and individual heads of barley in this case, trying to scrape together enough food to feed your family for a day. If you gleaned hard, you could probably get enough barley for a loaf of bread. This is welfare for those who are ready to work. And Ruth takes it on, like her mother-in-law, who you'd think, the Israelite native, the one who speaks and understands the language, who understands the customs, you think she's the one who would take the initiative, but Ruth is held up as this model of Christian diligence. How do we know she's a model of Christian diligence? Because Jesus notices. Boaz, the Redeemer, notices. Look at verse 5. You've not got your Bibles, you'll have to trust me, this is what it says. No, you asked a preacher to come and give one of these talks. What do you expect him to do? The preacher's got to preach. Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the young man who's in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who's in charge of the reapers said, "She's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please, let me go and glean among the sheaves after the reapers.' And so she came, and she's continued from morning right until now. She had one rest in the shelter, and she's continued till now." Boaz is so worried about it, he has to go and make havoc. Said, "Look, come have some food." And because she is a model of diligence and hard work in the hot Israelite sun. You know what it's like? Cleaning your car or mowing your lawn in the Texas heat. Nobody mentioned this to us, by the way. Actually, it was kind of obvious. Or think of Ecclesiastes. This is Solomon at the end of his days when he's learned some lessons the hard way. And what does he say that life is like? It says, to get clear, he has had, 700 wives, 300 concubines. He's been the wealthiest man, the most famous man in all the earth. What does he say life is like? Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Vanity of vanities. The word vanity is a strange translation of the Hebrew word here. The word means something like mist or vapor. The thought is that life is like fog or mist. Blows this way and that, hard to control, hard to predict, and you can't catch it. And then the sun just rises, and a few minutes later the mist is gone, and your life is just like, whew. And this man who has had it all and seen pretty much everything says, life is like that. And you know how the book proceeds? He goes around, it's like he studies the different things that you could do with your life. What could you put your hand to? What could you put your mind to? The pursuit of wisdom. You could put your mind to the pursuit of self-indulgence and pleasure. You could put your mind to the pursuit of work, and all of it, it's all hevel. It's all mist. It's all not vain in the sense of pointless, but vaporous. Here today and gone tomorrow. And then he has these brief and glittering moments of clarity, like at the end of chapter 2. He's just said everything has this vaporous, ephemeral, temporary, empty, in the end, character. And then what does he say? There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. The best thing, and I've seen it all, like 700 wives and 300 concubines and all the kings and all the queens of all the nations all across the ancient world, and that palace and that temple, and I've seen a lot. The best thing is to work and to eat the fruit of your labors. My favorite verse or little passage in the whole book is towards the end of chapter 9. Again, another moment of clarity. When he stops just making observations, and he actually tells his sons what to do. Go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart. God has already approved what you do. Remember, our work is pleasing to God. Enjoy life with your wife, all the days of this vain life that you live. Verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, work at it with all your might. Whatever it is, work at it with all your might. Or again, Proverbs 26. What's the opposite of this picture? Well, Proverbs 26 has 12 verses. The first 12 verses are this portrait of the fool. The fool is the man who never learns from experience and never listens to anybody. The fool is, verse 11, like a dog that returns to its vomit, so is a fool who repeats his folly. Do you see a man who's wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. A fool is a man who will never learn, never do anything productive, never listen, always knows best, never changes. What comes immediately after that? In chapter 26. How would such a man spend his days? The sluggard says, there's a lion in the road, there's a lion in the streets. As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. It wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. That's how the fool works. The fool who becomes the sluggard is the guy who dies of starvation because he's lying on the couch with his hand buried in a bowl of pretzels and he can't be bothered to stuff it in his face. So he dies of starvation because he cannot be bothered to do even that. And he's always got an excuse. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. Like, there are a few people in the Bible who get more of a beating than that guy. He is a fool. And he won't work. Let me tell you, if you're not ready to work hard, you'll never find your work fulfilling. You'll never enjoy it. You'll never find it interesting. I occasionally, as a pastor, have people come to me and they'll ask for advice. They say, so, Pastor, I'm not sure what to do. I'm finding my work really draining. I'm not enjoying it. It's unfulfilling. It's unsatisfying. I'm thinking I should look for another job. And I'm always a little nervous because I don't know. I don't know why they're finding it unsatisfying. Maybe they have the boss from hell and, $5 an hour salary and working conditions that you wouldn't leave your dog in. Or maybe they are just lazy. Maybe they were so lazy at school and have been so lazy in cultivating relevant practical experience since they left school that they can't actually do anything that's interesting. Like, the only jobs available to them, by definition, are pointless jobs, soon to be rendered completely redundant by AI robots. Like, here's the thing, I don't go to somebody's workplace, I don't know whether they're any good. Like, you could ask. Or you could ask your boss if you want to risk it. You could ask yourself. Like, am I actually putting my back into this? I promise you, there's no job in the world that you will enjoy, that you don't work at hard. Flip it around, though. The personal, energetic, passionate investment of your mind or your body in a mental or physical task is unbelievably fulfilling. I'll give you an example of this. Nicole and I have been married now 25 years. And when we were first married, Nicole was working in the oil industry, working for this big company, and she loved the work. And she was always saying how great it was. I was doing PhD stuff, and basically she was paying for my PhD studies. And I didn't feel so bad about that because she absolutely loved what she was doing. And so one day, it was one Christmas, I think it was the first Christmas party that I went to with Nicole, and the oil industry was doing really well. Oil was $16 a barrel, which was like so high, Anyway, so we went to this Christmas, and I was expecting to find a whole bunch of people like Nicole, driven, passionate, enthusiastic, competent, motivated, just overflowing with like joy and gratitude for working for this company. And I found the same cynical, tired bunch of loser victims that you find everywhere. And it suddenly hit me. It's not the job that is intrinsically fascinating, it's this person who brings to it that passion, that commitment. It's one of the many times in the last 25 years where I've just had to pinch myself, I get to be married to this lady. Because you notice that the things that we get it so wrong. We think, when I enjoy it, I'll give myself to it. I'll pour my mind and my heart and soul into it. Can we notice the correlation? Enjoyment, commitment. And we think that it flows that way. Wrong. I promise you, you will enjoy the things that you pour yourself into. And what you're actually doing is you're participating in God's project to renew the world. You're not a victim. You're a Christian. So get a grip, okay? Okay, so third. Now, fourth. Nod to my friend, Pastor David Rees. Risk is necessary in work, but it is hard to evaluate and is potentially disastrous if you get it wrong. If you turn to the Bible to try and find a theology of risk, you will struggle. And in consequence of that, there is loads and loads of flaky theology out there about taking risks for Jesus. For example, I'm really sorry, I'll make this quick. Abraham was called to go to a land that he'd never been to before. Go, leave your father's house and your kindred and your land and go to a land that I will show you. And Abraham upped and went. And therefore, we sort of baptize the idea of taking risks for Jesus. Let me just point out the obvious. Abraham was told what was going to happen, and he was told what to do. Abraham exercised faith, which is a good thing to do. If God tells you explicitly to do something, you should do that thing. But faith because you're confident of the outcome is not the same as taking risks. Because what risks are uncertainty regarding future outcomes. Risk basically means I don't know what's going to happen when I do this thing. I make an investment, I buy a product, I hire an employee, I take a new job, and I have some idea of what might happen, but I don't have a promise directly from God telling me what's going to happen, and therefore there's an uncertainty associated with it. So if you want a proper theology of risk, and you can see how you'd build it now, you'd build it out of the ingredients of our finitude and God's sovereignty. We just don't know. We're not in control, we're not omniscient, we don't know the future. God is in control, God is omniscient, God does know the future. Now, by God's grace, one of the things that he does is he tells us, firstly, the right attitude to have, and secondly, the kinds of things that, on average, in the long term, do generate fruitfulness. If you get up early in the morning, you work hard for 10 hours, and you do that 5 days a week or 6 days a week, then probably you'll have enough food on the table to feed the kids, which is roughly translated is about half the book of Proverbs. Right? And he also tells you the attitude to have, right? James chapter 4. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. You don't know what tomorrow will bring. You have no clue. So an attitude of humility. Somehow, our friend, Pastor David Rees, has to explain all this stuff about capital deployment and entrepreneurship and risk-taking in such a way that it doesn't make us leave thinking we know it all and living in flagrant denial of James chapter 4. So what do? Hand the mic to him, will do, tomorrow afternoon. But, Lord willing. But just saying, be ready to take risks isn't going to be very helpful. Or what risks should I be ready to take? All transactions, all ventures, all tasks, everything we might do embodies some element of risk. And you've got to figure out, firstly, what is it you're doing? What's the task that I'm undertaking? And then secondly, what circumstances am I in so that I can figure out whether this is a risk that I can wisely take? In the end, we know that there is a whole bunch of things that God graciously says, look, if you sow crops and don't sleep through harvest and work hard with your hands, you'll be able to provide for yourself and be a blessing to other people. There are certain things where there's at least a long-term, divinely sanctioned prospect of manageably good returns. But risk raises other questions. We are all basically risk-averse. And one of the challenges is to figure out whether we're averse to the correct risks. We might be averse to risks that we really should steer clear of. Like I was talking to a gentleman the other day, sells precious metals. In some contexts, precious metals have gone wildly escalated in value in quite a short period of time. Could I afford to put $500,000 into precious metals? No, it's a really stupid thing to do. What, $500,000? That's quite an easy question to answer. But even if I did, it's a foolish risk for me that I couldn't afford to sustain the reasonable possibility of a large downside. But you see, there are other factors that prevent us from understanding risk appropriately. At this point, let me tee up both Davids to talk about this for us at some point, as we think about risk in relation to investments, risks in relation to new businesses, risks in relation to anything where you're putting money on the line or putting time on the line. Because the problem is, if risk is about trying to manage uncertain future outcomes, in a sense, it is going to require some measure of statistical understanding. And unfortunately, we are really bad at statistics. We're really bad intuitive statisticians. The favorite bit of psychological literature on this that I've come across is classic research done at Harvard Medical School, where the researchers asked doctors to give a recommendation for treatment for lung cancer. Okay? Now, it turns out, this is a quote from a book describing the research. This is Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow. Here's what he writes. Physician participants were given statistics about the outcomes of 2 treatments for lung cancer, surgery and radiation, 2 treatments. The 5-year survival rates clearly favor surgery, but in the short term, surgery is riskier than radiation. And so all these statistics are presented to these test subjects. But there's a difference. The way that the data is presented, same data, differs between two groups of the test participants. So half of the doctors hear that for surgery, the 1-month survival rate is 90%. The other half of the doctors hear that for surgery, there is a 10% mortality risk in the first month. So you see what you've done? You've described the same thing using different words. You know what happens? The doctors who are told the data in terms of survival probability, 84% of them say, take the surgery. The doctors that are given the same data in terms of mortality risk, only 50% of them recommend the surgery. Why? Right? Because even experts are bad intuitive statisticians. We're bad at gauging uncertain future outcomes. We're bad at evaluating numbers. We don't know how to do it. And yet we do it all the time, and we probably make misjudgments. And this has been replicated in many different contexts. It's replicated in investment scenarios, in people moving house. It's replicated all over the place. This is, incidentally, and this is now both Davids again, this is one reason why you need an investment advisor. If you don't have an investment advisor, unless you are the 1 in 100 people who actually really understands markets and risk and statistics and all the things you need to understand in order to make wise financial decisions, what you're most likely to do is what everybody else does, which is to overreact to other people's positive experiences. You catch a dose of fear of missing out when somebody has some, I don't know, NFT or crypto widget, shiny object, is that what you call them? And you think, I've got to jump on board with this thing. Or you overreact to other people's negative news. So the market drops 15% and you're like, sell everything. Like every year, the market drops by 14% on average. And so what happens is we overreact because we don't understand probabilities, we don't understand statistics, we don't understand risk. And if the only thing your investment advisor did was to stop you selling when everybody else is selling and buying when everybody else is buying, they're probably worth the fee. And what's interesting is I just did another psychological test on you all now without you realizing it, because some of you, when I said NFTs and crypto, you went, I invest in crypto. Don't you? And see what you've just observed in yourself. If you will observe for a moment the feeling of mild irritation that you experience when I criticized crypto and NFTs as shiny objects, what you'll notice is that you are experiencing the outcome of a whole cluster of psychological biases. It's a narrative fallacy. You've got a neat story in your head about how you make money quickly and you beat the market. It's really easy. My friend made money on NFTs, and so can I. You've got this, what behavioral economists call associative coherence, where crypto is just associated with a bunch of positive outcomes that you've seen or think you've seen in other people. Then you've got the kind of cognitive sunk cost. You've already committed yourself mentally and emotionally and probably verbally, James chapter 3, to a certain view of things, and therefore you're not going to backtrack now just because the preacher happened to tell you that they're a bad idea. Remember, it wasn't me, it was him. And then finally, all that generates an illusion of understanding because you think you're an expert, because what happened was you saw this guy and it was this video, it was like on TikTok, and what he was doing, he was selling this course for $150 and you bought the course and now you know everything. You see? So if you're offended, that may be what's just happened. Not because I know anything about NFTs and crypto, but because it turns out to be harder than we realize to accurately evaluate the risks that we have to take in order to work fruitfully. Briefly, 5. The size and difficulty of this task that is set before us in Genesis 1 is so immense that it will take lots of people and lots of time to accomplish it. Lots of people, already implicit in Genesis 1, fill and subdue the earth. Good luck doing that on your own, Adam. So at some point, where's C.R. Wiley? There he is again. At some point, somebody needs to talk with us about how we coordinate the different tasks associated with my labor in the world with my responsibilities to my family. If I've got a responsibility to fill and subdue the earth, and I happen to be married and a husband and a father, then I have those responsibilities, and at the same time I have responsibilities in the workplace. And it won't do to talk about work-life balance, right? Work-life balance has rightly come in for a bit of a kicking in recent months and years because it massively oversimplifies what is actually a really, really complicated problem. Illustration, like if you've got a guy who's sitting at home with his kids all day, just having a fun time, and occasionally goes out and mows the lawn, and spending lots of late brunches with his wife, and saying hi to the neighbours, but never does a day's actual remunerative work. He hasn't got a problem with work-life balance. Okay, his work is terrible, and the rest of his life is terrible too. The problem is not about balance. The problem is just about doing it wisely and doing it well. But it's not just families. A conversation I had yesterday with a couple of people was about the same kind of pattern of coordination, but in other groups of individuals. The normal way in which people solve this problem is with corporations. You start as a one-man band, and I was talking to this guy, I think he's the 4th employee of a company. He's looking forward to getting paid in about a year's time when they finally make some money. And so what they're doing is that they're trying to engage in a larger project that can be done by just one person. And that requires trying to create incentive structures so that all of the individual people in that corporation all want to work for their own benefit, and what they end up doing also serves the benefit of the entity as a whole. Quite complicated with 4 people. How you do it with 100,000 people, I've no idea. And of course it generates a whole bunch of cynicism. Hands up if you've noticed any of the cynicism about big business in the last 3 or 4 years. And so there's been this, if I might say, overactive knee-jerk reversion to, I want to have my own little business, I want to do the kitchen table cottage industries and so on. It's great for the small number of people in the small number of domains for which they work. I don't know how you're going to pay the mortgage selling raw honey. Great plan if you can make it work, but you probably can't. And I certainly don't know how you're going to make an iPhone, like around the kitchen table. In fact, have you read Leonard Read's essay, I, Pencil? Like, the unbelievable sophistication of the coordinated economic and workplace efforts required to generate just the most simple artifact, so immense that we can't afford to be naive about how we solve those coordination problems. So I don't know how you do that either, but these experts will tell you. 6th, because the project requires lots of people, the character of those people suddenly becomes really important. Think about Proverbs chapter 26 again. If you've got to have all these people together, I mean, just imagine if you're running a company, like some of you are, right? And you're trying to employ new people, and you know that what just tends to happen is that the standard sources for recruiting people recruit the standard kinds of people for whom the workplace is a sphere for personal political activism. What do you need? You need some way of identifying people who want to actually just come to work. I had a conversation a couple of years ago with 2 guys at the church, All Saints Road pastor. Both of them responsible for numerous employees. Between them, I think they probably have 500 or so people reporting to them. One of them said, I quote, said, I've hired Christians before, and sometimes I think, never again. Because tragically, sometimes the character of those Christians, their commitment to the work they ought to be doing, just doesn't match up to what is needed. The cost of getting this wrong, of course, I call as my witness King Solomon. Just think of that man. Just think what he did. Almost the first half of 1 Kings is devoted to a spectacular account of his wisdom, his reputation among the nations of the world, the building projects, the capital city, the temple, his palace, He brought spectacular wealth in the country. Basically, he built Israel's first and only navy, the only time they've ever really had any international commerce over the seas. And at the same time, he's the most terrible husband, the most appalling father. And that didn't just impact his family life. You look at the account of Rehoboam, the son who took the throne after his father. And all of that astounding, unimaginable wealth just washed away because of one man's, what would we say, insatiable lust for sexual variety. It turns out that moral fiber really matters in the workplace. And seventh, finally, the size of the task means that rest is as critical as work. I don't know whether you'd expected to hear somebody talking about not working at a conference supposedly devoted to the subject of working, but you see it's built into the fabric of creation, no less than work is. The heavens and the earth were finished, all the host of them, Genesis 2, on the seventh day. God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he'd done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work that he'd done in creation. Why in the Ten Commandments are we told to rest? Because we're imitating God. The reason that we need to rest one day in seven is because God does. We imitate God in his work, we imitate him in his rest. You know, this is so important. In Exodus, after you got the Ten Commandments in chapter 20, chapters 21 to 31 are basically an exposition of the Ten Commandments, and it's broken into 7 sections. And each section begins with this little phrase, the Lord God said to Moses, or the Lord said to Moses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You get to the 7th section, which you know is the most important section, right? Because it's a climactic section, it's the final section. Exodus 31, verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, the most important thing, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. This is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. And of course, Sabbath, rest in biblical perspective, means abstaining from our normal work so that we can give ourselves to worshiping the living God, whom we're devoted to serving the other 6 days of the week as well. It means giving ourselves space for fellowship, giving ourselves space to build relationships, giving ourselves space to serve other people in a way that we couldn't do the rest of the time because we could never make money doing it, because the little old lady who lives next door or the elderly gentleman across the street can't pay you to mow their lawn, but you could do it for them. And honestly, if you are not a regular, enthusiastic worshipper at a faithful church, I promise there is nothing this conference can do for you. I get calls like this from people. I know it's hard, right? I know it's difficult because some of you are in places where like the church isn't the church that you choose. Let me tell you, if you've ever found the church that you think will be the church that you choose, I give you 6 months before you discover that it's not. The old joke is, of course, you ever find the perfect church, don't join, you'll only spoil it. But you see, commitment to worshipping the triune God with his people is, well, it's an exercise of faith, isn't it? It's you saying, not just, yes, Lord, I'm going to embrace faithfully the ministry, the privilege of working like you work to beautify the world and provide for myself and my family. It's also saying, Lord, I trust you to provide for me when I'm not working. One of my favourite stories, and friends at All Saints, you've heard me talk about this before, but forgive me for the sake of those who haven't. My former deacon at the church I have privilege to pastor in London, Nick Pike. Nick opened a restaurant in Harpenden, just north of London, called Bar Azita. He opened it in the early 2000s. Yeah, that's right. Worst recession in the generation, 30 years or so. Not the time to launch a restaurant. From the very first week, he never opened on Sunday. All of his staff got a 1 day off a week on the weekend, Unheard of in the hospitality industry in England. To get a day off, England doesn't have Chick-fil-A, okay? If you work in the hospitality industry, you don't get a weekend. All of his staff always had Sunday off. What would his secular financial advisor have said to him? He'd have said, the profit margins in the restaurant industry are between 3 and 6%. Paper thin. It's why if somebody says, I've got a great idea, I'm going to open a pizza restaurant in Chicago, right? You say, great. With somebody else's money, you do that, right? Paper thin profit margins, something like 18 to 24% of revenue comes in on Sundays in England to restaurants. There is no accountant in the world who would say, yeah, you should start this restaurant in the middle of the worst recession in history, living memory, and you should cut 20% of your revenue at source by not trading on the most profitable day of the week. There are now 2 restaurants and a tapas bar, all under this growing, prosperous brand. Last time I looked, they're one of the most popular restaurants in Harpenden because Nick Pike trusts the Lord to provide for him. So he keeps Sabbath and ensures that those who work for him do the same. Might mean you have to work harder the rest of the week. I expect it does. Actually, Nick's son-in-law, Andre, look him up if you ever go to England, Andre Saxman Brown. He's a professional musician. He's got the problem even worse, right? Because not only is Andre Saxman Brown, he came to me, he joined the church, he said, Pastor, I'm trying to work out what to do about my business. I've already committed, I'm not going to work on Sundays. Well, that's cutting a bunch of revenue, Sunday brunches, jazz cafes in London, this kind of thing. He said, but the problem is Saturday night. That's the biggest night of the week. And I might have a gig 3-4 hours away up north in Leeds or something. Now, 3 or 4 hours in England's a long way, okay? You don't want to drive 3 or 4 hours on those roads. And he's like, what do I do? Can I do the gig on Saturday night? And I said, yes, you can. But you break your neck to get to church. If you have to rock up at church with 1 hour's sleep and 4 gallons of black coffee, and as soon as the service is over, you're not coming to the fellowship meal, you're going out to fall asleep in the back of your car, that is completely fine, but you break your neck to get to church. That's what your kids will remember. That's what your kids will remember. And that will mean you don't do the Solomon thing. And it all dribbles away. That's the only way actually to resist the vanity, the hevel, the mistiness of which Solomon speaks in Ecclesiastes. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, Paul writes, 1 Corinthians 15:58, because you know that in the Lord your labour is not in vain. Why is your labour not in vain if it's in the Lord? Well, it's because that sweat of your face by which you shall eat bread was experienced by somebody else. Remember Genesis 3, the curse on the ground comes in the form of sweat from your face, hard work. Sweat is only mentioned 2 other times in the Bible. Once it's in Ezekiel 44, where the priests are not allowed to wear anything in the sanctuary that would cause them to sweat, because sweat is a picture of cursed work. You don't bring cursed stuff into the sanctuary. There's only one other place in the Bible where sweat is mentioned. It's in Luke 22. His sweat was like great drops of blood falling on the ground. His cursed work has removed the curse for you. You may have to work extremely hard. You will never work as hard as Jesus. You will never find work as thankless. You will never find work as painful. You will never find work as frustrating. You will never find work as lonely as Jesus did. My God, why have you abandoned me? Well, God the Father abandoned him for 1,001 reasons, one of which is so that we might follow our big brother and work. So let's get to it, shall we?